Okay, I'm going to try to explain how I make my metal fittings for the center section of the wing. What I have here is a piece of plywood that I always use whenever I have holes going through the soft spruce. These pieces of plywood that you'll see in the pictures, I put these on all the locations on both sides of the spars where the holes and where these metal straps are ultimately going to go. This shape is just something that I came up with. It incorporates plywood for the strap, and it incorporates plywood for the other metal pieces that get welded to this, as well as the pulley. So this is the shape that I just came up with. It's simple and pretty straightforward. Now, I use these individual pieces. They are match drilled to the spars. So for the most part, these pieces of plywood are all identical. There's 8 of them. And the only difference between them are the holes. For the rear spar, there's a couple of extra holes for the pulley. The front spar of the center section does not have the pulleys. But the shape and the hole locations of these pieces of plywood are all identical. So I use this piece of plywood as a template to sketch out my drawing here on this piece of stainless. This is the piece of stainless that I actually do my welding on. So I just put my piece of plywood down and I trace out the outline of the plywood and I mark the hole locations, and then I center punch those locations onto the piece of stainless. Also using the plywood, this is a hole that needs to be in place for one of the straps that wrap around the spar. And using that hole as a reference and looking at the plans, which calls for this strap that goes in this location to be 3/4 of an inch wide, I centered that dimension on this hole and drew these lines here and this diagonal line here to incorporate this hole. What this has done, if you can see that shape, that gave me the shape for this piece here. This piece then, as you can see, goes right like that. Now the reason I wanted to incorporate this hole with the metal piece is because, again, when you look at the plans, this strap here comes all the way up and gets welded on the top. So if you can imagine this piece here, this metal strap comes all the way up and gets welded here, and I decided to stop mine underneath and weld it. What that does, rather than having this piece on top of this piece, it comes up underneath it and gets welded, so this piece and this piece are on the same plane. There's not one on top of the other. Since I decided to do that, the metal strap for the pulley sits on top of this, and I wanted it to sit on top of this as well without having to shim underneath it. So I went ahead and made this metal piece that will go this way. Now this piece and this piece are flat, and then I can just put my pulley right here and not have to shim underneath it because these are on the same plane. So I took these lines and I copied them onto my plate, and then I draw up templates, which I think I have shown in another picture, and I bend up my fittings. This is the fitting that I had just showed to incorporate the hole for the pulley, and then this is a fitting for the front spar, which does not have this pulley hole, so it's just a plain strap this way. So now I have this onto the metal. I do one this way, and then I do a duplicate with it flipped over this way. And then I take my strap and I line up my hole locations with the strap like this, and I center those locations onto the holes of the plate, or the hole locations on the plate, I center those on within the holes of the strap. And then I take my piece here and I line it up with these lines, push it up against the strap like that, check for alignment, make sure everything's straight and correct. And then I'll take some little weights and put them on this to hold it in place, maybe put a little weight on top here to hold it in place, and then I'll tack weld it here. Then I take the whole assembly, which is now tack welded, and flip it over and match it to the other strap that goes this way. And again, I line up the holes with the punch marks and put the strap on, and then tack weld it there. And what you end up with then is something like this. This piece originally started like this, and I tack welded it in here, and then I took this strap, laid it on here, and I flipped the assembly over this way, lined it all up, and then tack welded it here. And here's the finished piece so far. I think it worked out good for me. I like it. I'm going to continue to use it to do my other fittings. Then I'll have to come back and weld my pieces here for the cabane itself, and then of course finish welding these joints here. So that's a mildly brief description on how I did this, how I plan on continuing to do it. And of course I'll have some still photographs as well as some further explanations. Alright.
These are the modified plywood backers that I had talked about in the previous clip. Another nice thing I should say, maybe, about modifying the fittings the way that I did is that you do not need to stack these backer plates. On the original plans, some of these plates go physically underneath the metal fitting, so the metal fitting lays on top of these, and then there are other plywood pieces that slip up against the metal fittings to help support it that way. So you have metal fittings on top of the plywood, and you have metal fittings that are butted up against the sides of the plywood. Modifying the fittings so that the fittings are all on the same plane, you can just put flat pieces of plywood in place and then drill through them using the holes in the spars as a guide.
Okay, so here I am at the welder. I've got my stainless steel plate down. I got my first strap down. I've got it lined up with the holes and the marks on the stainless steel plate. I've got my strap piece pre-bent, and I've got it in line with the pencil marks on the template, as well as up against this piece of metal here where it's going to get welded. These are just some metal weights that I use to help hold everything down in place, and I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of tack welds on that strap. And there are my tack welds, just a couple small ones there. Now what I'll do is I'll take this piece and I'll flip it over, and using this second strap I will get it aligned onto this drawing here with the holes lined up with the center punched holes here, and I'll weld this strap here to this piece here. So let me get that all lined up and weld it. Okay, so there it is. I just completed my second weld, and you can see that this piece along with this piece, they're all on the same plane. This is nice and flat. It's like that on both sides. And then I'll take this and I'll test fit it onto the plane, onto the center section. If it fits good, then I'll go ahead and finish welding these welds completely. And then I'll make up whatever other pieces I need to make up that will come off of here, that will get welded onto here, coming down this way, and go from there. Alright.
As with most things that I fabricate from scratch, I start out with a template. This template is for the wing attach / cabane fitting that mounts to the rear spar that incorporates the pulley. This was made with a simple CAD program that I had printed out onto a manila folder and then cut it out in the shape that you see here, and then I transfer that onto my steel and rough cut it using a shear, and then to get these internal cuts where you see the multiple holes drilled, I chose to drill the holes and then bend that piece and snap it out of there and then file it by hand. Now I could have used a bandsaw, but at the time I couldn't locate a suitable bandsaw to do the work that I wanted it to do, so I ended up having to drill this line of holes, snapping that piece out of there and then cleaning it up by hand. Here you see the cleaned up piece. You'll notice that the corners are radiused pretty deep. That is so when I make the bend on those black lines that the corner there of the bend will not crack, or it will not crack in the future. So you want to make sure you have the corners radiused nice, you have the edges cleaned up smooth, and you have the any sharp corners radiused a little bit, just to keep the piece smooth and clean. That way when you bend it, you won't have any cracking or splitting. And again, you want to make sure that you orient the template onto the metal so that your bends will be perpendicular to the grain of the metal. If you make a bend with the grain, it will crack. This fitting here is the forward cabane fitting. Does it matter if it's forward or aft? I'm not sure, but this is the actual fitting for the cabanes. I'm using aluminum cabane struts, and those struts fit up in between these fittings. These fittings sit down over top of the entire strut. So these are actually, my cabane struts I think are 1 inch wide. So these fittings when bent need to be a little over 1 inch wide. And then I incorporated the little tang there on the bottom for the cables. So that forwardmost hole is going to incorporate the diagonal piece that goes from the cabane down to the engine mount, and then the tang sticking out of the bottom is for the cable, and then the hole that's between the two, that is the hole that actually attaches the fitting to the cabane strut itself. Now you notice how these cabane fittings, when they're welded to the rest of the bracket, they're offset. I did not weld them centerline, and I'll show you pictures of that in a minute, why I had to do it that way, but they cannot be welded in the center. If you weld them in the center, they stick out too far on the outside and they'll end up interfering with the end rib, but I'll get to that in a moment. And then these are just a couple of pictures of the finished product, completely welded and cleaned up and bent and sandblasted, ready for primer. Here is a good picture explaining why I did not weld that forward cabane fitting onto the metal strap that it welds to centered. Had I centered that fatter cabane fitting onto the smaller strap below it, it would have interfered with the end rib. So the inside of that cabane fitting needs to be in line with the inside edge of the strap that it welds to, like you see in this picture. That way there will be no interference. And then of course, as I said, that cabane fitting is as wide as it is because the strut itself is going to sit down in between these the fitting itself, and the bolt will get bolted completely through. The pulley straps or the pulley fittings are pretty much made directly from the plans. They are very simple and straightforward to make. It's just a bottom strap with 3 holes drilled into it, and a top strap that is bent with 290-degree angles to fit over top of the pulley. Now what I want to make note of is the tight fit between the top bent strap and the pulley itself. You'll see that it's just tall enough for the pulley bearing to slip in underneath it, and it is just wide enough to clear the pulley itself. You'll note that the strap itself, being this close to the pulley, acts as the cable guide, so there's no need for a separate cable guide or cable I don't know what you want to call it, keeper, I guess. The strap itself will do that for you if you keep it nice and tight to the pulley. Here is the finished fitting assembly assembled onto the rear spar of the center section. You'll note that the main body of the fitting sits completely flat up against the plywood backer. Again, since I did not stack any of the metal pieces one on top of the other, that since I had kept them all on the same plane, they fit flat up against the plywood backer without any shimming or spacers. So that in turn allows me to bolt the pulley assembly directly onto the fitting as well. There are no spacers or shims required on either end of the pulley bracket because everything is flat, flush, and on the same plane. You'll also note toward the top the U-shaped cabane fitting that it is offset welded. Again, like I had talked about, had it been welded centered onto that strap, it would have protruded out and interfered with the end rib. So it needs to be, the edge of that fitting needs to be lined up with the edge of the strap that it gets welded to. That will be no interference with the end rib. And I believe that's about all you can gather from this photograph. Moving on then to this next photograph, this is just an overall view of the same fitting. Again, obviously this is the rear fitting on the center section with the pulley assembly. You'll note the cabane fitting is just a basic strap. It's wide enough for the cabane to sit down into and get bolted, and it's got the little bent tang off to one side for the cable. Again, this is just a straight piece of strap that was bent to incorporate the shape that I want and the little tang for the cable. Now this fitting here is the forward 2 fittings on the center section, obviously with no pulley, and it has the little bit different shaped cabane fitting, U-shaped cabane fitting, because it needs to incorporate, I made it to incorporate the whole area required to attach it to the forward engine mount. And again, you can see that everything was welded on a single plane, so everything fits flat, flush up against the plywood backer.
Hey everybody, just wanted to say real quick again, thanks for checking out my YouTube videos, and just a couple of real quick tidbits before you leave. If you'd be so kind as to check out my GoFundMe page, the link is down in the description of these videos. For those of you who find it in your heart to donate for this new cause of mine, I've got another project going on, and there's some really cool things I'd like to do with this aircraft, and again, that's all explained in my GoFundMe. But if you find moved enough to go do that and donate, I've got this horizontal stabilizer skin, and donors will get their name put on this skin, and ultimately when this gets filled and the aircraft gets finished, this is going to be hung up on the wall of honor in my hangar. Just a little bit of recognition for those donors who helped make the project a reality. Another thing too is, I'm sure you've noticed that even this video that I'm making right now is of the same or worse quality than the video that you just watched, and that's because, believe it or not, this camera is the exact same camera that I filmed the original hint videos with. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not really sure why, but I know the video quality lacks, but hopefully the information within is worth something. And the other thing that I wanted to mention real quick is, again, these are little snippets from my hint video DVDs, so a lot of these individual clips just kind of come to an abrupt end. That's just the way it is when I'm trying to rip these DVDs apart and re-edit them into small little segments, and they just kind of end weird at times. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And again, thanks, and I hope you'll come back, check out my channel, and see if there are any new videos and updates. All right, I'll talk to you then. See you.